In the rain-drenched hills of North Carolina, a tiny bobcat cub clings to life, trapped in a storm-swollen culvert as a murder of crows dives to tear it apart, until a single gunshot echoes, changing everything. Was it nature's cruelty or a human hand that pushed this fragile creature to the edge of death? Rachel Harper, a wildlife biologist haunted by her past, stumbles into a mystery that will test her soul, save the cub and risk everything, or walk away from a truth too dark to face. Hit that subscribe button and help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers to uncover stories where survival hangs by a thread. In the rain-drenched hills of North Carolina, a tiny bobcat cub clings to life, trapped in a storm-swollen culvert as a murder of crows dives to tear it apart, until a single gunshot echoes, changing everything. Was it nature's cruelty or a human hand that pushed this fragile creature to the edge of death? Rachel Harper, a wildlife biologist haunted by her past, stumbles into a mystery that will test her soul, save the cub and risk everything, or walk away from a truth too dark to face. Hit that subscribe button and help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers to uncover stories where survival hangs by a thread. The night was a chaos of water and wind, the kind of storm that turned the quiet foothills of western North Carolina into a battlefield of nature's fury. Whispering Creek, usually a gentle trickle winding through Cedar Creek's outskirts, had swollen into a coffee-colored torrent, uprooting trees and swallowing the road's edges. Rachel Harper gripped the steering wheel of her battered Jeep, squinting through the relentless downpour as she navigated home from an emergency meeting at the community college where she taught wildlife biology. At 42, Rachel was more at home in the forest than in lecture halls, her colleagues often joking she'd rather talk to bears than people. Tonight, though, she just wanted her cabin, a hot shower, and silence. Until something caught her eye near the bridge. A flicker of movement by the drainage culvert, where roadside runoff gushed into the creek, stopped her cold. At first, she thought it was debris, a plastic bag or a sodden branch, until black wings fluttered in the mist. 5, maybe 6 crows circled like vultures, their harsh caws cutting through the storm's roar. They dove in turns, sharp beaks glinting as they struck at something pinned against the culvert's rusted grate. Rachel slammed on the brakes, her hazard lights flashing amber in the dark. "What the hell?" she muttered, grabbing her raincoat and stepping into the deluge. The crows scattered as she approached, their indignant cries mocking her intrusion, but they didn't flee far. Perching in the skeletal branches of a nearby oak, watching. Kneeling in the mud, Rachel's breath caught. There, wedged against the grate, barely keeping its head above the churning water, was a bobcat cub. Tiny, soaked, no more than a few weeks old. Its spotted coat clung to its frail frame, one golden eye swollen shut, the other flickering with a fading light. Blood matted its fur where the crows had pecked, and its head tilted unnaturally, a sign of trauma too severe for something so small. "Oh, you poor thing," she whispered, her heart sinking. She'd seen death in the wild before, fawns torn apart by coyotes, fledglings dashed from nests. But this felt different. That single eye locked onto hers, not pleading, not afraid, just there, as if daring her to decide its fate. Rachel's mind raced. This is nature's way, she told herself, survival of the fittest. But then a memory stabbed her, a fox kit, 10 years ago, dying in her arms after she'd failed to save it, its glassy eyes haunting her dreams ever since. "Not again," she growled, shoving logic aside. The culvert grate was heavy, slick with rust and rain. Rachel wedged her fingers under it, grunting as she pulled. The crows swooped again, one slicing her hand with its beak, blood mixing with the runoff. Another struck from behind, knocking her forward. Her forehead slammed into the concrete edge, stars bursting in her vision. Pain seared through her, but she screamed, "Get off!" and swung wildly until they retreated. With a final heave, the grate gave way, and she scooped the cub into her arms. It was a weightless bundle of bones and fur, cold as death, unmoving. "Don't you dare die on me," she choked out, cradling it inside her raincoat. Back in the Jeep, she cranked the heat, her hands trembling as she tucked the cub into a towel on the passenger seat. She floored the gas, racing toward the bridge, when a deafening bang split the air. The Jeep lurched, a tire blown out by storm debris, skidding toward the creek's edge. Rachel yanked the wheel, her pulse hammering as the vehicle spun, stopping inches from the drop. A faint whimper came from the towel. The cub was alive, barely. "Hang on, Jasper," she named it then, voice breaking. "Just hang on." But as she steadied her breathing, a question gnawed at her. Was this just nature's wrath, or had that gunshot she'd heard meant something far darker? The rain pounded Rachel Harper's Jeep like a drumbeat of doom as she sped through the storm-soaked night, the tiny Bobcat cub, now Jasper, bundled in a towel beside her. Every jolt of the blown tire felt like a countdown to disaster, but she couldn't stop, not with that faint whimper echoing in her ears. Mountain View Veterinary Hospital was 30 minutes away, a lifeline in the chaos, and Rachel's only hope rested on her oldest friend, Dr. Claire Donovan, the region's sole wildlife vet. She hit the hands-free call button, her voice tight with desperation. "Claire, I've got a bobcat cub, head trauma, maybe worse. He's barely alive." Static crackled before Claire's calm, clipped reply came through. "Rachel, you know the odds. If he's that bad, nature's already decided." Rachel's grip tightened on the wheel, her knuckles white. Nature didn't decide anything. Those crows were tearing him apart, and I swear I heard a gunshot before I found him. I'm not letting him go without a fight. Claire sighed, a sound heavy with years of pragmatism. "A gunshot? That's a whole other mess. Bring him in, but don't get your hopes up. He's probably too far gone." The call ended, leaving Rachel alone with the storm and the memory that clawed at her. A fox kit, 10 years back, its broken body going limp in her arms as she'd whispered useless apologies. "Not this time," she muttered, flooring the gas despite the Jeep's shuddering protest. The hospital loomed ahead, a squat brick building glowing faintly through the rain. Rachel burst through the back entrance, Jasper cradled against her chest, her raincoat dripping a trail of mud and blood. Claire was waiting, surgical gloves already on, her sharp hazel eyes narrowing as she took in the sight. "Jesus, Rachel, you look like you've been through a war." She gestured to an exam table under harsh fluorescent lights, and Rachel laid Jasper down gently, his tiny form looking even more pitiful against the sterile steel. Claire's hands moved with practiced efficiency, lifting his head, checking his pupils, but she froze mid-matement, her breath catching. "This isn't just crow damage," she said, voice low. "Look at this graze along his skull. That's a bullet wound, shallow but real." Rachel's stomach dropped. "A bullet? You're saying someone shot him?" Claire nodded, peeling back matted fur to reveal the telltale tear crusted with blood. "Could have been a hunter, maybe someone trying to finish him off before the storm hit. If that's true, this isn't just a rescue, it's a crime scene." The words hung heavy, a thunderclap of implication. Rachel's mind raced. Jasper wasn't just a victim of nature's brutality, he'd been targeted. A anger surged through her, hot and raw. "Who'd do this to something so small?" she demanded. But Claire's expression darkened further. "If he's part of an illegal hunt, keeping him could land you in trouble," Claire warned, setting down her tools. "Wildlife laws are strict. Outside hunting season, interfering with a targeted animal means fines, maybe worse. You'd have to report this." Rachel's jaw clenched. "Report it and what? Let some bureaucrat take him away to die in a cage? No chance. He needs me." Claire's gaze softened, but her tone stayed firm. "Shh, then we're breaking rules together. But if he survives, you'll have to face this eventually. Someone out there might be looking for him." The next hour was a blur of frantic effort. Claire refused anesthesia. Jasper's pulse was too weak, his breathing too shallow, but she hooked him to fluids, cleaned his wounds, and injected antibiotics. Rachel hovered, useless and frantic, her hands still stinging from the crow's beak, her forehead throbbing where she'd hit the culvert. "Stay with me, Jasper," she whispered, stroking his damp fur. Claire worked in silence, but finally stepped back, peeling off her gloves. "He's stable. For now, no promises. If he makes it through the night, we'll talk options." Rachel sank into a chair, exhaustion crashing over her like the storm outside. She stared at Jasper's fragile ribcage, rising and falling in faint, uneven gasps. "I couldn't save the fox, Claire," she said suddenly, voice breaking. 10 years ago, I found him in the woods, legs snapped. I tried, but he died right there looking at me like I'd failed him. I see him every night." Claire knelt beside her, a rare crack in her stoic shell. "This isn't the fox, Rach, but you can't save them all, and you need to ask yourself why this one matters so much." As Claire left to check supplies, Rachel leaned close to Jasper, tears slipping down her cheeks. "You're not dying on me," she vowed, but the gunshot lingered in her mind like a ghost. Who had pulled that trigger, and why? Was she fighting nature, or something far more sinister? The storm had quieted to a mournful drizzle by the time Rachel Harper carried Jasper into her cabin on the edge of Cedar Creek's protected forest. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of wet pine and the faint hum of a space heater she'd dragged into her rarely used guest room. She'd turned it into a makeshift ICU. Jasper lay in a plastic crate lined with thermal blankets, a heating pad beneath him glowing faintly orange. Under the dim light of a desk lamp, he looked impossibly small, his spotted coat patchy and dull, his head still tilted at that heartbreaking angle. Rachel knelt beside him, her hand hovering over his tiny frame, afraid to touch, afraid to hope. "You made it this far, little fighter," she murmured, but the silence that followed felt like a held breath before a scream. She'd canceled her morning classes with a curt email to the department chair, her focus narrowed to the rise and fall of Jasper's chest. Every 15 minutes she checked his breathing, jotting notes in a spiral pad. 2:15 a.m. shallow but steady, 2:30 a.m. no change. Claire had sent her home with fluids, antibiotics, and a syringe of formula, along with a warning, "He's hanging by a thread, Rach. Don't get attached." But attachment wasn't a choice anymore. It was a tether pulling her through the night. She forced down a stale granola bar, her stomach churning, and pulled an armchair close to the crate. "Just rest," she told herself, but her eyes burned with fatigue and the clock ticked on relentlessly. At 2:47 a.m., the world shattered. Jasper's body jerked violently, a spasm ripping through him like a lightning strike. His legs thrashed, claws scraping the plastic, his mouth gaping in a silent cry as foam bubbled at his lips. Rachel lunged forward, heart slamming against her ribs. "No, no, no," she yelled, hands shaking as she tried to hold him still. Another convulsion hit, his eyes rolling back, white and sightless, and then nothing. He went limp, his chest still, the crate eerily quiet. "Jasper!" she screamed, pounding the floor, tears streaming down her face. She fumbled for her phone, dialing Claire with numb fingers. "He's seizing. He's stopped breathing. What do I do?" Claire's voice cut through the panic, sharp and urgent. "Hold him steady. I'm 10 minutes out with adrenaline. Don't let him go." Rachel dropped the phone, scooping Jasper into her arms. His body was a rag doll, cold and slack, but she pressed him to her chest, rocking back and forth. "Stay with me, please," she sobbed, her voice breaking into a wail. He twitched once, weakly, and then bit down hard on her hand. Instinct or pain, she couldn't tell. Blood welled up, hot and sticky, but she didn't let go, clutching him tighter. "Fight, damn it! Don't leave me!" The fox kit flashed in her mind. Those lifeless eyes, that failure, and she buried her face in Jasper's fur, crying like she hadn't in a decade. Headlights sliced through the cabin's windows as Claire burst in, soaked and breathless, a medical bag slung over her shoulder. "Move!" she barked, dropping to her knees beside Rachel. She pulled out a syringe, the needle glinting with a dose of adrenaline, a last-ditch gamble. "This could kill him faster if his heart can't take it," she said, her eyes locking with Rachel's. "You sure?" Rachel nodded, tears choking her words. "I'd rather lose him trying than watch him slip away." "Do it." Claire plunged the needle into Jasper's chest, her hands steady despite the stakes. 1 second. 2. Rachel held her breath, the room spinning. Then a shudder ran through Jasper's body, and his ribs heaved with a ragged, miraculous gasp. Rachel collapsed against Claire, sobbing uncontrollably as they watched Jasper breathe, weak, uneven, but alive. Claire wrapped an arm around her, her own eyes glistening. "He's back, Rach. He's back." They sat there, trembling in the aftermath, Jasper's tiny chest rising like a fragile promise. But as the adrenaline faded, Claire's voice turned somber. "We just crossed a line. Nature didn't bring him back, we did." Was that right, or did we go too far? Rachel wiped her face, staring at Jasper's flickering golden eye. "I don't know," she whispered, "but he's here. That's all I care about." The night stretched on, silent now, but heavy with questions. Had she saved Jasper for him or for herself? To bury a ghost? And what cost would this miracle demand? Dawn broke over Rachel Harper's cabin with a pale, hesitant light filtering through the pines to cast long shadows across the guest room where Jasper lay. 2 weeks had passed since that heart-stopping night, and the tiny bobcat cub had clawed his way back from the brink, slowly, unevenly, but undeniably alive. His crate now sat on the screened porch, a larger space where fresh air mingled with the scent of damp earth. His golden brown coat had regained some luster, the distinctive spots standing out against the tawny fur. Those scars dotted his head where the crows and something worse had struck. Rachel watched him from a wicker chair, a mug of cold coffee in hand, marveling at his resilience. But the tilt of his head and the tremor in his legs told a harder truth. Jasper would never roam the wild again. Claire Donovan had been by every other day, her stethoscope and gentle hands tracking Jasper's progress. "He's a miracle, Rach," she'd said at her last visit, peering into his brightening eyes. "Neurological damage is still there, balance issues, maybe seizures down the line, but he's fighting." Rachel had smiled then, a flicker of pride cutting through her exhaustion, but the victories were bittersweet. Jasper could stand now, wobbly and uncertain, and he'd even swatted at a feather toy she'd dangled for him. Yesterday he'd taken his first real step, only to collapse seconds later, his amber gaze meeting hers with a quiet defiance that broke her heart all over again. "You're my warrior," she'd whispered, brushing his fur. That morning she decided to bathe him. His coat still carried the faint grit of the storm. As she ran a warm cloth over his back, something clinked against the sink. A small, twisted piece of metal lodged in his fur near the bullet graze Claire had found. Rachel's breath hitched as she picked it up. A bullet fragment, no bigger than a pea, its edges dulled by blood and time. The room spun. This wasn't just a theory anymore, it was proof. Cold, hard evidence that someone had tried to kill Jasper before the storm swept him away. Her hands shook as she set it on the counter, 1,000 questions crashing in. Who? Why? And what did it mean for the cub she'd poured her soul into saving? She called Claire immediately. "It's a bullet, Claire. Fell right out of his fur. This wasn't an accident." Claire's voice crackled through the speaker, tense. "That settles it then. You've got to report this. Fish and Wildlife will want to know. Could be poachers or worse." Rachel paced the porch, glancing at Jasper, who'd curled into a tight ball in his crate. "And let them take him? Turn him into evidence? No way. He's not a case file. He's mine." Claire's sigh was sharp. "You're playing with fire, Rach. If someone's looking for him, keeping that bullet quiet could put you in their crosshairs. Think about what happens if they come for him. Or you." That night, the air turned heavy, the forest beyond her cabin whispering with unseen life. Rachel sat by Jasper, her notebook abandoned, when a sharp knock rattled the front door. She froze, pulse spiking. No one visited this late, not out here. "Who's there?" she called, voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. A man's voice, rough and unfamiliar, answered through the wood. "Heard you found a bobcat cub. Lost mine in the storm. Wondering if it's the same one." Her blood ran cold. She grabbed a kitchen knife, easing toward the peephole. A shadowy figure stood on her porch, rain dripping from a hood that hid his face. "Not here," she lied, her grip tightening. "Try the creek." He lingered, silent, then turned away, disappearing into the dark. Rachel sank against the wall, heart pounding. Was he the shooter, a hunter covering his tracks? She didn't sleep that night, keeping vigil by Jasper, who stirred and pressed his head against her hand, a clumsy, trusting gesture that nearly undid her. Tears welled up as she stroked him. "You're safe with me," she promised, but the bullet burned a hole in her pocket. Reporting it could stop a killer, maybe save other animals, but it risked losing Jasper to red tape. Or worse, keeping it secret protected him, yet left a threat lurking in the shadows. "If I stay quiet, who pays next?" she whispered to the night. The next day she made her choice. Jasper would go to Blue Ridge Wildlife Center, a sanctuary where he'd be safe. But the bullet stayed with her, a silent vow to find the truth. "I'll fight for you," she told him, voice fierce, "no matter what it takes." A month had passed since Rachel Harper handed Jasper over to the Blue Ridge Wildlife Center, a sprawling sanctuary nestled in the misty mountains outside Asheville. The drive up had been a quiet one, her Jeep humming along winding roads as she clutched a carrier lined with Jasper's favorite blanket, a faded plaid thing he'd claimed during those fragile weeks at her cabin. He'd left him in the hands of Margaret, the silver-hailed director with decades of rehab experience, who'd promised a quarantine space before moving him to a permanent enclosure. "He'll be a star here," Margaret had said, her voice warm. "A junior ambassador for conservation education." Rachel had nodded, forcing a smile, but the hollow ache in her chest lingered as she drove away, the bullet fragment still heavy in her pocket. Now, standing before Jasper's new home, a naturalistic enclosure with climbing logs, hidden dens, and a trickling stream, she felt the weight of that choice anew. The late May sun filtered through the canopy, dappling the ground where Jasper sprawled, his coat gleaming with health despite the faint tilt of his head. Two other bobcats, both adults with their own scars from a wild they couldn't return to, lounged in nearby spaces, their eyes tracking her with lazy curiosity. Margaret stood beside her, clipboard in hand. "He's adjusted faster than we expected," she said. "Took to the platforms like he was born for it, even with the balance issues. We'll introduce him to the others soon. Bobcats can bond here, you know, despite their solitary nature." Rachel's throat tightened as she called his name. "Jasper?" His ears flicked, and then, miracle of miracles, he turned, those golden eyes locking onto hers. He pushed himself up, wobbly but determined, and padded toward the chain-link fence, his gait uneven but stronger than she'd ever seen. When he reached her, he pressed his head against the mesh, a low rumble in his throat as she slid her fingers through to touch him. "Hey, little fighter," she choked out, tears spilling over. He nuzzled her hand, a clumsy gesture that shattered her composure. She sank to her knees, sobbing softly, a mix of joy and loss washing over her. "You remember me?" she whispered, and for a moment the world was just them, two survivors bound by a rainy night and a desperate fight. Margaret rested a hand on her shoulder. "You can visit any time, Rachel. He won't forget you. None of them do." But as Rachel wiped her eyes, a shadow crept into her thoughts. The bullet. That stranger at her door. She'd overheard a hushed conversation at the Cedar Creek Diner the week before. Locals whispering about a group of off-season hunters, men with rifles and no permits, spotted near Whispering Creek before the storm. "They've been quiet since the floods," one had said, "but they're still out there." Her pulse quickened. Was one of them Jasper's shooter? The thought ignited a fire in her gut. She'd saved him from crows and storms, but the real threat might still be stalking the hills. Back at her cabin that night, Rachel sat on the porch, the forest alive with cricket songs and rustling leaves. A crow landed on the railing, its black feathers glinting in the moonlight, tilting its head as if studying her. She didn't flinch. Not anymore. It wasn't the enemy. It was a witness to the same wild chaos she'd stepped into. She pulled the bullet from her pocket, rolling it between her fingers, its weight a promise and a burden. "I'll find them," she said aloud, to Jasper, to the night. "You're safe now," but I won't let it happen again, to you or anyone else. The center would give Jasper a life she couldn't, a purpose beyond survival, but her fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. Claire had texted earlier, checking in. "You okay letting him go?" Rachel hadn't replied yet. Unsure how to explain the shift inside her, she thought of Jasper's eyes, that fierce spark despite his scars, and wondered, did I save him to heal my past or to change something bigger? The crow took flight, a dark silhouette against the sky, and she let the question linger, unanswered. She'd visit him next weekend, maybe volunteer like Margaret suggested, but the bullet meant more now, a call to action, a thread to unravel. Jasper's story had grown beyond that roadside gutter, touching lives he'd never know, and Rachel's had too. She stood, resolve hardening, and stepped inside, leaving the door open to the wild she'd never turn from again. Was Rachel's fight for Jasper about redemption or a bigger justice? Where should her story go next? Share your take in the comments below.